Thank you, Mr. President. As I stated previously in seeking the adjournment, this wouldn't be the contribution that I would otherwise have preferred to make on the bill. And I'm going to tread my way very carefully, and then I will be absent for any elements of this debate that require votes. So I understand that this bill relates to the future research opportunities in what are now Commonwealth waters and the arrangements to be put in place for providing permits and oversight of that. I'm going to just make my way through and ask some questions that I trust the leader will be able to provide some answers to in her summing up, without providing commentary on those questions. Some of them have arisen from material we have all seen. They're ones I've drawn on from others' notes and work in that way, rather than necessarily reflective of my own views, and certainly not committee views on the matters that they cover. In relation to the consultation that is undertaken, in relation to the identification of suitable areas of Commonwealth waters for activities of research to be covered by this bill, I note their calls for clarity on the process of consultation on identifying those areas, especially consultation undertaken at that initial step, which is done by, I understand, the federal government. And there's some concerns about the scope of that consultation that have been raised in materials. So I'd like to understand in some more detail from the government, or have placed on the record in more detail from the government, what the state government's understanding is of the consultation process and the decision-making framework that will be applied by the Commonwealth in their process initially of identifying these areas. I recognise that's not a state government responsibility, that initial identification, but I would imagine the state government would have an understanding about the Commonwealth's approach. I'm particularly interested in more clarity there. I'm interested to understand how that intersects with the MOU that's been signed. Has the Tasmanian government, in signing the MOU, already agreed to a particular and documented consultation process and decision-making framework that will be used by the Commonwealth in their initial steps, identifying those areas? I note that in the bill, the permit approval process is at the Minister's discretion, and it does require that the Minister consult with the Director of the EPA, and is required to incorporate any conditions specifically for finfish farming that the Director considers necessary. Some discussion during the briefing this morning was had around that discretion of the Minister, and some clarity about the power, where the power resides if, for example, the Director of the EPA didn't believe a permit should be granted. So perhaps the Leader would like to, in her summing up, include some explanation of specifically clarifying that power in that kind of instance. Noting some of the matters raised in some of the materials that have been received by members, including me, I'm interested to know whether the state government has a documented policy on managing competing interests of existing and potential new users to apply to decisions made in granting research permits. Is that a documented policy so that people can understand and see what that looks like? Management of those competing interests. If the state government doesn't have a documented policy on this, perhaps the leader can provide a rationale around why there's an absence of that and explain, without a documented policy, what the basis will be for considering competing interests. In terms of the participation of the Director of the EPA in the process of permit approval as described under this bill, because this isn't the same process as, say, the Director of the EPA granting an environmental licence for an activity. It's the Director of the EPA being consulted on potential conditions, is my understanding, that might be applied to a permit. Will the Director of the EPA have a documented set of principles or guidelines that will be applied to their consideration of permit applications and the setting of possible conditions? And if conditions are placed on a permit as it's approved by the Minister, as a result of the Director of the EPA requesting them or directing that they are, who will monitor, report on and enforce the conditions placed on the research permit? And where will that activity be undertaken and responsibility be held for that? And in relation to any monitoring, reporting on and enforcing of conditions on permits, will there be public transparency on those activities of monitoring and reporting and enforcement in relation to permit conditions? In terms of enforcement around permit conditions, noting that already in the Act, Section 15.2, I believe it is, relates to penalties and has penalties specified. Are those the penalties that will be applied for non-compliance of permit conditions in relation to activities intended to be facilitated under this legislation? And if so, have those penalties been reviewed and assessed as appropriate, specifically for the circumstances relevant to this bill? I note that in terms of opportunities for public participation or consultation in the processes described in the bill, that the requirement to conduct stakeholder consultation may not be in the legislation itself, maybe elsewhere. Perhaps the government could point to and further elaborate on where the opportunities will lie in the processes described for the public to participate and be consulted and have input. And if there are matters where we see matters described as appropriate stakeholder consultation, if the government could speak in more detail about what it regards to be appropriate stakeholder consultation, so we understand well when that is mentioned. And in terms of, along a similar vein, I'm interested to understand to what extent there will be public visibility around permit applications to ensure transparency. I believe that's nodded to some extent, but perhaps the government would like to describe that in more detail and explain why we wouldn't have full access or full visibility of some of that material, commercial and confidence matters aside if there are any, rather than I think the way it's described is as a summary. So perhaps some detail around that. We discussed in our briefings this morning to some extent and heard about the makeup of the Blue Economy CRC and its partners and its funding to some extent. So I think some comments from the government in terms of its understanding about the funding of the research projects and the beneficiaries of the research projects, both in terms of intellectual property and results, but also in terms of the commercial gain that can, to the extent described in the bill, be gained from the activities, particularly if it does exceed covering the costs of the research activity, where then that goes in the mix of things partnership-wise with Blue CRC, and whether the state government is involved in that as a beneficiary in some sense. Excuse me, I'm just scanning my notes. I think I need to move on from those bits. I think I may have covered the bits I'm comfortable covering today. Let me just check this last section. Well, perhaps a little more detail in terms of that degree to which commercialisation of the research product, the fish, essentially, say if it's a finfish research project, the extent to which that is determined to be sufficient to offset costs or go beyond that, and the revenue generated. Is there a formal way that it's determined that an appropriate degree of commercial return is being achieved within the research activity? I'm also, from some of the submissions and the correspondence received, going to raise, for more clarity, some questions that have arisen around the fees applied to the issuing of a permit. What principles will be applied to the setting of the fees? Will the principles that are applied to the setting of those fees be publicly documented? Will fees be set in order to cover the regulatory activity that may be required from state government agencies and the EPA, or in excess of that level of return in order to cover regulatory activity? Will it be more? And if so, what are the principles for determining the level of that? Will fees collected on permits issued under the bill be hypothecated to regulatory agencies or functions to cover costs that might be associated with it? And will fees be set to include a return to the Tasmanian people for use of public waterways? I think that is the most I'm going to make as a contribution, those sets of questions. And as I said, I'm disappointed that I'm not able to make a more full contribution in which I could share more information and share my view more fully. But I hope that at least putting those questions on the record assists with the public documentation of the passage of the bill, while I won't be participating in voting on it.